I always get caught up in that intro song, Minette. So thank you for letting me dance and for dancing along with me. But hey, everybody, welcome and happy darn Tuesday. It's CultureCast Day, and I am super excited to have this badass leader with me today, Minette Norman, who is the author of The Boldly Inclusive Leader, and just frankly has demonstrated that as a boldly inclusive, badass leader in Silicon Valley. I'm just going to say that. I know we'll talk about that. So welcome, Minette. Good to see you. Where are you today?
I am at my house in Fairfax, California, which is just north of San Francisco in Marin County, and it's a
Oh my
beautiful day.
gosh. Right? Yeah, I'm in Southern California, Newport Beach right now, and it is a beautiful day in SoCal. I'm glad that it's equally in NorCal. And I just want to do a quick shout out to my friend Julius Wilder, who wrote and produced that fun intro song for CultureCast, which, I always get caught up in like the bass and like at the very end. It just reminds me of the conversations that I have with people, which we're about to jump in with you, Minette. So, Minette, before we get into the boldly inclusive leader, I would love to jump into who is Minette? Like, what is your journey? And before we get into how you even ended up writing this book and how you ended up in Silicon Valley from a career standpoint, like, who is young Minette and how did you get to Silicon Valley?
Who was young Minette? Well, young Minette grew up in Oakland, California, San Francisco Bay Area. My parents
Yeah.
moved from the East Coast when I was 2 years old, so I really grew up in California. And I'm trying to think, like, how would I describe my young self? I was a voracious reader. I lived a lot in the world of imagination, and in high school, I got really into acting.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, yeah, so I spent my whole high school years in acting, and then I went to university on the East Coast, and I majored in drama because I really thought I was going to be an actor. That was my young aspiration, and I studied drama. I also had a double major in French, and I fell back on that second major when I
Wow.
realized, when I got out of college and went to New York City thinking I was going to make it as a stage actor, and realized how brutal that world is and how hard it is to be rejected all the time when you go to auditions. And this is how I got to Silicon Valley. I fell back on my second major, which was French. I was fluent in
Yeah.
French. I got a job in the French Trade Commission in New York City back in the mid 80s when they were introducing computers for the first time. And I found that I enjoyed learning, and I enjoyed helping others learn. And that was kind of my stepping stone into Silicon Valley. I decided after 5 years in New York City, I was going to move back to California where I'd grown up. And this is now the late 80s. And
Yeah.
well, I'm good at actually understanding technology and helping others. So how about if I try to get a job as a technical writer? Someone said you'd be good at that. So I applied to the few software companies I could find in 1988, 89 in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I got hired at Adobe in the fall of 1989 when they were developing Photoshop 1.0. And
Wow.
so, yeah, that was my first job in Silicon Valley. I wrote the Photoshop 1.0 tutorial, and then I ended up spending
No
the next 30 years
way.
in the industry.
You are OG in
I
so
am
many ways.
OG.
I mean, that's so wild. So before we get into like, I didn't know this about you, Photoshop 1.0, and that you wrote the tutorial on it. But going back to this imaginative young being in Oakland, and growing up in Southern California and knowing what I know of Oakland too, I'm sure that you've seen that whole transformation of, I call it Oaktown, but like Oakland, and living through that. And it's interesting. I have met and known so many professionals, leaders that I've worked with, team members that I've worked with across my career, where interestingly, their undergrad has been drama, but then they've crossed over into the whole learning, leadership development field, not thinking that that's what they were going to do. It was like you. If you were going to be the stage actor in New York, I think many of these colleagues and leaders and friends that I've worked with also had that same view, whether it's theater, being on stage in New York. And I think it's mainly stage acting. So I think that's an interesting theme, which we won't unpack today, but to hear that with your background, I can see some of those characteristics around helping people learn. but also you have to be bold in leading. And what I mean by that is a lot of the L&D back in the late 80s or early 90s was people literally standing up in front of audiences, right? Leading them through content that they are now needing to learn as part of their job and part of being successful, whether it's technically in their job or soft skills wise as a leader. And I think especially back in the 80s and early 90s, like that was the primary role of L&D. It's changed so much now. There's so much that is now kind of self-serve and online and digital, but I'm not surprised, I guess. I don't know what are your thoughts on that. I know I'm kind of digging into that, but to be a drama major, and then I love the second degree in French, but your thoughts on that? Did you ever think that? Like,
Well, it is very interesting because people have asked me about that throughout my career. Like,
yeah,
and the question I often get is like, do you use any of the skills that you learned in drama and in acting as a manager, as a leader in tech? And the answer is always yes. And some of those skills, I think they're not like obviously transferable, but I
yeah,
think they served me so well. I mean, one of them is just comfort speaking in public. Like,
yes,
that was just something I was also used to from training, but also improvisation and like being able. One of the things that I think is one of my superpowers is I don't feel like I have to memorize anything. So as when you're a leader, you're going to get thrown really hard questions and unexpected things are
yes,
going to come up. And to be able to just be in the moment and be okay with that ambiguity and like I don't have to have all the answers. And I think that served me really well. And I guess the final thing I would say that I think is a great learning from being part of whether it's being a stage production or TV or whatever it is like understanding how many people and how many different talents and skills it takes to put together a play or a
yeah,
show. And I felt like that was exactly what I understood in the software industry. It's not just the engineers or the designers or the product managers. It takes this collective intelligence to put something out. And that is very much what it is to put on a stage production or a film. You need everyone with their diverse backgrounds, talents, ways of seeing things.
totally. And I love that. I mean, I love that, you're reminding me, my first job out of college in the early 90s was working at a company called Unisys. And I recruited people like you, right? We would find technical writers who would come in and either write on our software or hardware product, which then we sold to institutions. Um, and I just think about your point of diversity in that perspective and what it takes to really get something through that. I'll call it the value chain of the service or product that we are delivering to the customer, that it really does take everybody to do that. And that was my perspective of being in HR. And I remember actually going to a software development meeting, and a PM would be saying, well, I'd say, can I sit in your meeting? And he's like, well, it's not open enrollment time and there's nothing that you need to develop. Why do you want to sit here? I'm like, I want to understand what it is that you all are working on, and like what it takes to do what you're doing, and to also understand why people are so passionate about this product and what you're working on. And so I think that's interesting. And then going back to your thoughts on improvisation, I love that too from a leadership standpoint. And I actually see, oh, Jerry's back. So Jerry, you're also one of those people who I have worked with and learned from in my career, who also had that drama background and ended up just being this amazing leadership development learning leader in the organization. But when I was listening to you, Minette, about improvisation, how much leaders feel like they have to give you all the answers, or they're not really listening, they're just ready to spout something out, versus I think what Jerry's saying here, which I agree with, it's about being present, right? And just being able to roll with whatever you're receiving from that person in front of you, and and just reflecting on that versus having to know what the answers are. Because I love that improvisation factor. I think that is a skill that maybe you translated in the book, which we'll talk about eventually. That role of a leader, being present and listening and going where they're going. I love that.
I think that is one of the most underrated and yet most important skills of a leader is to be a great listener.
Yeah.
And I think that, there's so much like the former, I would say the former models of leadership where the leaders had to have all the answers, had to be perfect, had to be like the ones that, were impervious to anything. And like, I think that has to change, and that no one can know everything, no one can see everything, and we do better by listening to divergent perspectives and different
Yes.
backgrounds. And so I think it is, to Jerry's point, being a great listener is one of the most critical skills for leaders.
Totally agree. And I think that kind of lends to the culture that leaders create, and why I've called this CultureCast, and why I'm so grateful to have you as part of CultureCast, because it is about creating this community and an audience. And, whether it's HR people, whether it's leaders, there's also early in career people who like to join this. So it's a diverse group of people who really want to learn from experts like you on how they can create environments where everyone can thrive. And so I'm going to lean in first and say, all right, if you were to define the word culture, like what does culture mean to you? If you were to
Mm.
define it.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about culture is really how we behave every day, and what is rewarded, what is tolerated, what do we dismiss, what do we punish, what do we ignore. That's all part of culture.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is how we roll. And I think the behaviors that we allow and reinforce and celebrate, it's all of those things, the good and the
Yes.
bad, is
Yeah.
the culture that you create, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I,
And I think, I guess I would just maybe just double click a little, is that
yeah.
we can let cultures just organically evolve, or we can be deliberate in shaping the cultures that we want, the cultures where people can thrive. And I think we have to do the latter, because often we get into these very toxic and unhealthy cultures, and then like to undo a culture like that and to rebuild a culture is very hard. So especially if you are starting out, or you're a new leader, is like, how do I create this culture where everyone can fully participate, where everyone can thrive? That should be my goal.
Yeah, I agree with you. And actually, culture is going to exist totally. So when you double clicked on it, it's fascinating having interviewed thousands of people in my career, hundreds of thousands of people in my career. And, one of the popular questions has always been, what is the culture like? What's it like to work here? And you're right. If companies and leaders don't pay attention, it's hard to overcome the reputation that that work environment might have. And I also say this culture is a reflection of leadership, whether it's
Yes.
the culture of you as a leader and the team that you support, or that you directly support, the culture of the leadership team and how they're leading an organization. I agree with you that you have to be intentional about what it is that you're trying to um, shape in your organization, and be intentional about, are people thriving, or do they feel like they belong to what's happening in this organization, that they can contribute, all of those things. So there is an intentionality. It's going to happen regardless of what you do. I think the intentionality is how you actually focus it towards thriving,
Yeah.
and bringing that out of people. And so I'm going to go back to your OG-ness. Like, I
By
am
the way, I just
happy.
love being called an OG and a badass and all those
You're
things.
just a full on, first of all, in Silicon Valley. I'm not even telling secrets when I say, in the 80s and 90s, and to be a female leader. And I mean, I just think about Adobe. Who doesn't know what Adobe Photoshop is, first of all? But then, secondly, being the original OG tech writer to write all of that. And I know in your career, you've ascended to high leadership roles too. Like, you've been an executive leader in Silicon Valley. What's that experience like? And I know for many of the diverse women and men who are on this culture cast right now, I get they understand it, but I'd love for you to articulate, what's that like, especially in navigating your career. And I'm
Mhm.
sure being a unique being, I'll just say that, amongst not a lot of unique beings. So,
You know what's funny is when I think about those early days, like I got hired in 1989 and then I left the industry in 2019. So it was really those 30 years. And I feel
Wow.
like the early years in like in Adobe, when I was hired at Adobe, I think I was employee 250 something or other. It was very
Wow.
small. And in a way, I felt like a lot of us felt like we were a bunch of misfits who came together to do this amazing work. It wasn't, you didn't have the Silicon Valley culture back then because it
Yeah.
was just starting. Then over the decades, it became much more like, these elite culture. There was sort of the insiders and the outsiders. It became more, just much more clearly a male culture. Like,
Yeah.
there was definitely a male dominated industry, but it felt like that, we got worse over the years, not better. I mean, I didn't see a lot of change, honestly, in those 30 years. And, so by the time I got out of being an individual contributor and into management roles and then increasingly large leadership roles, you definitely saw that the senior leaders were mostly men,
Yeah.
mostly white men too. And the women, there
Mhm.
were women sort of in the first levels of management, but less and less as you got
Yeah.
further up the food chain. And then for me, like that executive role, that my last 5 years in tech when I was VP of engineering. So, again, like this drama French major who's a woman who
Right.
becomes a VP of engineering. That's a story unto itself. And I can tell you any part of that you want, but it was definitely being the first and being the only. It had been all men before me in that role.
Yes.
And I definitely saw the role from a very different perspective in that everyone in the role before me saw it as a technology role. Like, this is
Hmm.
about our tools and technology. And when I took over the role, I certainly had a technology mandate. I mean, my mandate was actually pretty huge. I was supposed to get like 2,500, 3,000 engineers off of their proprietary technology and onto a common tech stack. And it was like, undoing 30 years of culture,
Yeah.
basically. But the way I approached it was like, I have great people who can work on the technology piece of it. What I need to do, and this is where you will appreciate this, is
Yeah.
I need to change the culture here,
Yes.
because our culture was highly siloed. We were a company that had grown, as many Silicon Valley companies do, through acquisition. And every time we acquired a company, we didn't actually integrate them well. So we
Hmm.
had, pockets of the business that all felt different, behaved differently, acted differently, no collaboration, constant reinventing of the wheel because teams were not working together. And I
Yeah.
felt like my job is like, I need to break down these silos. I need to try to get people to listen to one another, to collaborate, to be open to different perspectives, and to realize that we are going to be stronger collectively together than if we are just reinventing the wheel. And so my job as VP of engineering was honestly as a culture catalyst. And I
I
think
love that.
that's what I focused on for the 5 years I was in that role.
Well, I can only imagine. I mean, having worked in similar environments, not tech my entire life, but when you talk about growing through acquisition and then not really doing the job of integrating and people competing versus working together to solve a problem, and especially if you're kind of going through getting everyone on a common tech stack, like that's exhausting work when you're like competing against each other. But I'm going to put a pin in that because I also do want to go back to early days. And actually, this is what I love about, and I think why people love startups and why they love these founder led cultures. And appreciate you sharing the story about early days, your employee number 250 at Adobe, and how it's like, oh, we're a bunch of misfits who came together to kind of figure out this new thing. And I think having been part of startups early times at brands as well, and the vibe and the culture that is created because everyone's kind of in it to like figure this out together. And then at some point, I had a CultureCast guest on over a year ago, and we're talking about like the startup, and then there's certain stages you get to where you lose that, right? And you lose that founder culture and this camaraderie, right, that people have because they are like drawn to something that you all maybe the outside doesn't believe in, but like, heck yeah, we're going to come together and make this happen. Like it's that vibe that just brings people together. So I don't know, you're making me now think of another theme, which, I'll put a pin in it, but like founder led cultures and why people are so attracted to that versus, these, then at some point they become large bureaucratic organizations that, and, I will let you lean into that a little bit, where in your experience, being led by primarily men. white men and being the first of, whether it's a female. And here's what I loved about you too, this minute that I met you, I'm like, oh my God, like a sister. I'm so vibing with you because you're also very expressive, not only in, the words that you use, but just how you show up communicates. And so I'm just curious what that was all about too, showing up. Now you are this VP leader in engineering. I have to believe there is a version of Minette that we are experiencing right now is what they experienced as well. And like having a leader who can completely, fully just own who she is and showing up. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Well, uh, honestly, I mean, there's this whole word authenticity that I think has been
Yeah.
overused these days, but I
Yep.
don't really know how to be anything but myself. And I feel like we do ourselves a disservice when we have to pretend to be someone we're not. And of course, throughout my career, I was definitely trying on different things like, is this how I want to show up? And is this how I not want to show up? And
Yeah.
we do that. But by the time I got to that VP position, I had been in leadership for a long time. I had completely taken over another department and really done a transformation. So I had a certain level of confidence, like I can do this.
Yeah.
And I refuse to pretend to be someone I'm not. I also refuse to try to be one of the boys. Like when
Yep.
it's really interesting. When I took over the role, when I was actually trying out for the role, and I say trying out because when I interviewed for the position of VP, I didn't get the job right away. I was given a 90-day trial. And I
Yeah.
often say like that was the biggest audition of my life because I had to like
Yeah.
do the role for 90 days and then see if I was going to get it. And one of the reasons I got the trial was the SVP who was going to promote me to that role said, I need it. He was very honest. He said, the engineering leadership in this company is entirely a boys' club. And it was at the time, all the engineering leaders in the company were men. And he said, I need to see if you can break into the boys' club. And
Wow.
so you can take that many ways. And
Yeah.
the way, go ahead. Did you want to say something?
No, no, no. Keep going.
Okay.
Go. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you could interpret that as like, are you going to be one of them? Like, are you going to be seen as one of them? And I took it that as like, okay, that's an interesting challenge. And I'm going to be very, very transparent with all the leaders, all the engineering leaders in the company. And I had conversations with each one of them. And I said, look, there's some concerns about my ability to do this job. I am not an engineer. I am not a guy. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And what was so interesting is that almost every single person I spoke to said, you know what, we need something different. We need change. The company's going through change. We need someone who sees things differently. And we actually really respect that you bring a different way of seeing things, a way of doing things. And so I just kept showing up as Minette. And, I am not someone who has all the ideas. I've never
Yeah.
thought of myself as like I'm the most innovative person on earth. What I'm really good at is like bringing people together, getting people to
Yes.
speak, listening, synthesizing, pulling out the best ideas, and then being the person who can communicate that. And so I think I leaned into my strengths and I refused to try to be someone I wasn't. And not everyone likes that, but luckily it was at the time, and it didn't last forever. It lasted for
Yeah.
about 5 years. But for those 5 years, I was seen as someone who, was a really strong leader and who brought a different perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that you had to audition or you were trialed for the first 90 days before you
Yeah.
actually formally got the role. And the mandate was like, can you break into the boys club? I love the response that you got though, that you went to all
Yes.
the other leaders and just got their feedback and that they actually back then to me that is diversity in action in terms of recognizing that, hey, in order for us to get to there, we can't do it the exact same way we got to here. And
Yeah.
like, you're going to bring a different perspective that maybe we are not seeing, right? Like, you think of all the terminology as an HR nerd that I would use, like the biases that they may have, like, forget that. Like, they got that. And that they're like, we welcome someone who can help us and not stay on our toes, but actually think differently about
Thank you.
how
Yeah.
we navigate through this change. And,
Yeah.
I'm hearing you talk about who you are and how you led, as a VP of engineering leader. You said this earlier, this wasn't about you leading them through the technical aspect of getting everyone aligned onto the same tech stack, you've got smart people who can help you do that. But really, the role of the leader is to do exactly what you're talking about. It is about bringing the best out of everybody, to get to like this amazing end result. And to me, when we talk about this boldly inclusive leader, which we can lean in on right now, I'm curious, all of those lessons learned, and I know they come to life in the book that you ended up writing. But I'd love to get to that point of like, is that kind of what manifested at some point that you're like, okay, how do I bring these lessons to life and then give this gift to people? To how do they drive outcomes, right? Business outcomes, business results through creating a culture of being boldly inclusive. So I want to hear about that. Like, how did that translate to, all right, now I'm going to go share my wisdom and create, write this book. It's amazing.
Thank you. Well, it was an evolution. What I saw is that I just learned so much myself in leading. I was leading very global teams, so I had teams in Asia and North America and Europe, and I learned so much from my staff, honestly.
Yeah.
And I felt like, in the beginning, when I started managing people, I thought everyone thinks like me and there's one size fits all. And I quickly learned everyone's completely different and one size does not fit all. And then I realized also, I started to learn through, especially leading very global teams, but also just like very diverse teams and personality difference and neurodivergence and all of that is like, oh, the best ideas, I think this was like the key aha moment for me. The best, most innovative ideas do not come from the loudest people. And they don't come from the most obvious people. And the most dominant personalities in most meetings are what I found are not the people who have the most out there innovative ways of thinking. And so I learned so much about like, how do we tap into all of the talent and really bring out those ideas and bring out all the voices. And ultimately, like what led me to writing the book was that I had learned all this and I felt like I wish I had learned this earlier in my career.
Yeah.
I feel like so many leaders could do so much better. I believe it's all learnable. I don't think you have to be, instinctively empathetic or instinctively whatever communicative. I think you can learn these skills. And I think the problem is that most people don't understand that what have been traditionally called soft skills are the critical, powerful leadership skills. And so I decided honestly, when I was eventually I was forced out of my job. Like I had 5 good years or maybe 4 good years and then one kind of bad year and I left. And I realized, okay, now's the time. It's like, you've learned so much. You spent 30 years in Silicon Valley. People can benefit from all those lessons. And so I decided to write this book. And I love that you said it's a gift because that's what I wanted it to be. I just felt like I want to give a gift to people. Maybe they're earlier in their leadership careers, or maybe they're in the C-suite already and they're open to learning something new. And that's what I wanted to offer them. And so, I did it. I was funny because I had outlined it in like 2019 and kind of sat on it and pondered and ruminated. And then I finally sat down in 6 months, cranked out the book. So.
That's an amazing story. You're such a role model just to say like you outlined it and then you cranked it out in 6 months. That's pretty amazing. But I'm going to go back to, I love this, what you said about how the most interesting or out there innovative ideas don't always or often come from the loudest person in the room, and how it is maybe the people who, because they are motivated differently, right? They have a different personality style, communication style, but how, again, it is taking the time to really pay attention and really see and hear people for who they are and bringing that out of them. I think about leaders, early days for me, and actually I had always had men leaders for a while, and then women leaders, and then back to men leaders who were like my direct manager. And I remember early on, I was such a noob in my career, and his name was Cliff, and Cliff sat down with me and he's just like, hey, that meeting went really well, but I noticed that you didn't say much in the meeting. And I'm like, and then I told him what I thought, and he's just like, this is great. Thank you for sharing all your thoughts with me now. But then in the meeting, I think people miss out on the thoughts. Like, so for him to really recognize that maybe I needed to come out of my professional shell when I was so new in my career. Although people don't believe me when I tell that story, it's true. Like, I think it's that whole, everyone here has more experience than me, and should I say something, and all of that. And to have leaders to actually take the time post facto, but then in the moment in other meetings, he would just say, all right, we'll have like a certain sign where I'm going to look at you. Like, I know you're going to have something to say, at least put it out there. It may not be, as elegant as you want it to be, but I think that as an inclusive leader, and I go back to you saying, look, I think the unlock for leadership, even in today, I want your point of view on this. Everyone's like, oh, AI is like the next big thing, right? Duh, we've been talking about that over the last couple of years. But I think the biggest skill that we have yet to unlock, and I agree with you, I think it can be learned, are all of these kind of social skills, right? Like the skill of listening, the skill of um, engaging with people, having empathy, et cetera. And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I mean, clearly you've written a book on it, but I think that is the biggest unlock right now, especially with new technology that now we're managing workforces around that. 81% plus are now utilizing AI. And the biggest burnout factor is that whole social piece. And how are you keeping people mentally and emotionally fit and agile in what they're doing? So I don't know your
Oh,
thoughts
it's
on that.
huge. I have
Yeah.
I have lots of thoughts, and I think this is the time, like in the world of ubiquitous AI, I think
Yes.
this is where we need to absolutely double down on our human skills and our humanity, and this is the only way we're going to continue to function in this world. And it's really interesting. I was asked to give a talk about staying human in the world of generative AI, and one of the acronyms I came across in sort of just doing some reading on it was FOBO, fear of becoming obsolete. I don't know if you've heard that one yet,
Oh,
but
yeah. FOBO.
FOBO, it's a big one. And of course, like one of the things that I read a lot of studies, and there's a
Yeah.
study that comes out actually every year by Business Solver that is called the State of Workplace Empathy Report. And it's a
Okay.
very interesting report. This is the 9th annual year that it's come out. And what they found this year is how many, like the high percentage of people suffering from burnout, mental illness,
Yes.
including 55% of CEOs are reporting having mental health issues in the workplace. And I think, AI and the pressures around it are contributing to that. And I think this is where leaders need to really pay attention to not only their own well-being, but of course the well-being
Yeah.
of everyone who is working on these very challenging projects that we're dealing with and solving complex problems. And so that's why we need to really lean into empathy and listening and communication and creating psychologically safe and inclusive workspaces where everyone can contribute and where people can speak up and ask for help and all of these things. I think it is more critical and crucial now than ever that we pay attention to these skills.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's really interesting around that statistic that 55% of the workforce, including CEOs, are reporting that they are experiencing, not mental wellness and burnout because of just the demands. And I think a lot of that too is just how work has evolved and how we collaborate and communicate together, whether it's in person, hybrid, fully remotely, and that ability to connect. And I was chatting with another CHRO the other day, and it's kind of like, productivity is definitely waned in her organization. And yes, they have technology to help them kind of increase capability, but she's saying like this burnout factor. So it's kind of bringing to life this report that you're referencing, that it's burnout. And then do people even care at this point? And so it's
Yeah.
bringing back to people caring about themselves, caring about what's in front of them in terms of the work that they do, but then as leaders, really showing that care, that you care about the well-being of somebody and their ability to bring their best every day,
Yeah.
And so I think you're right. I think now more than ever, especially with AI, like how do you bring the human into what it is that you're doing? And so I'm curious. I know people can go and pick up your book and read it, but if you were to define, as we defined culture, if you were to define what it means to be a boldly inclusive leader, what are the high level traits and behaviors that you would define if, you know, who was Minette the boldly inclusive leader? Or if you were to have a benchmark leader, how would you describe that boldly inclusive leader?
Well, I think it really starts with where we started, is it's someone who listens and who is open,
Yeah.
not just listening so that then I can respond and give you my smart perspective, but instead someone who listens with true curiosity because they're open to learning from others. I think that is the
Yes.
first, maybe the first thing about being a boldly inclusive leader. And then it's also how you show up and how you set the tone as a leader for the culture. And that comes down to, what do you celebrate and what do you tolerate,
Yeah.
and what are the things maybe that you're not saying that people are now guessing what you mean, and being very explicit about what you care about, what you are going to reward, what
Yeah.
you will not tolerate. And I think a big part of that is not tolerating these toxic cultures that are so pervasive. So that's a big piece of it. And like not having tolerance for that toxic rock star who may be
Yeah.
like your genius, but who is really bullying people in the organization. That we do not tolerate that as leaders. And then I think we have to be, I think that boldly inclusive leaders are very self-aware of how they're
Yeah.
showing up, how they're listening, how they're reacting when they get challenged, and how they can pause before responding so they don't inadvertently lash out at someone that challenges them, but really invite different perspectives. And then the way I think of it is like it goes beyond your own behavior,
Yeah.
and it goes to like, what are the conditions that you create for your team and the culture of that? And that often plays out in meetings. For example, how do you make sure everyone's voice is invited and welcome? And how do
Yes.
you ensure it's not just the most dominant, loudest person who gets to share their ideas? And this is where I offer lots of practical tips on how do you run inclusive meetings. And maybe that's first we work asynchronously before the meeting, and everyone gets to put their ideas down on a whiteboard or
Yeah.
something like that, just to really bring in all the ideas and make sure it's not about the loudest, most dominant person. And that we pay attention to, and this is the other book that I wrote on psychological safety. I think this is where inclusive leaders understand that by default, it is not necessarily safe for everyone to speak up. It does not
Yeah.
feel like you can share a divergent perspective, or you can ask for help, or you can ask for a question. And so you have to deliberately create the conditions where it is safe. And I offer tips for that. And then I think this is it sort of goes back to a discussion you and I had before
Yeah.
we got on the air, is about paying attention to not only, first of all, your own behaviors, then
Yeah.
your team behaviors, but then to look at the systems and the equitable systems in place for your
Yes.
organization. And so, does everyone have the same opportunity? Whether it's pay equity, whether it's promotion, whether it's stretch assignments, like where are the biases in the system, and how can we systematically change that so that we do a pay audit, for example, and make
That's
sure that
right.
everyone.
Yep.
So I think we have to go, the way I look at it is almost a progression of, we look at ourselves as leaders, we look at our own behavior, we become self-aware. We then create the conditions in our teams, and we help our other leaders create those conditions in their teams for a safe and inclusive culture. And then we broadly look at the systems within our organization to make sure that they are equitable so that
I love
everyone
that.
has the same opportunities. That's the way I think about it.
Oh, I think that's such a great framework to think about it. And it really starts like, and I've had other leaders that I've had the chance to interview. Culture really starts with you as the leader.
Yeah.
And I love this because it's about behaving in a way that you want to model the rest of your team. I think about this being open, being curious, and truly being that. Like someone will roll up to Minette and they'll have an idea, and you're like, great, I want to hear more about it, right? And no matter
Yes.
what the communication style is, just allowing for that to happen. So I love that it starts with you and being highly self-aware and being intentional about how you create space and hold space for others, and just how you express yourself. It's like modeling what you're expecting of the rest of your team. And then to your
Yes.
point, creating an environment where those behaviors can exist for the team, and then they're creating those environments around them. But I love too, and I know we kind of got into this before we got on air, on then what are the systems that you create, right? And I love that you got specific. And I mentioned this before we jumped on. Just remind everybody, hey, we're jumping on this LinkedIn Live and this podcast. And there's been a lot of hubbub. I won't say by whom, but huge conversation for many of you who are probably listening to this around, hey, this organization that is widely known for the human resources trade, specifically, I know globally, but mainly in the US, everyone gets certified, that this huge announcement around their DEIB framework, how they're going to lean in on the I, the inclusivity, and remove E from the actual framework. And there was a lot of discussion around it. But I think the way I weighed in was actually they all work together. And I won't repeat. I think what I said was inclusivity means the golden rule: treat people how you want to be treated. But then equity is like treat people the way they want to be treated. How it all goes together. But I love your point about in organizations or communities that you're a part of, when you look at the systems and how we organize people, bring them together, communicate, educate, assess, etc., that you are also creating structure where it creates, an equitable playing field, right? I love that you used example as pay equity as one example. It is about, are you paying across gender and across race for the same skills and performance for people? And the way you do that is actually being really deliberate with pay structures and decision-making structures around how people get paid. I also grew up in the days in the 90s where I'll use this term performance management was completely new back then. And it used to be that leaders at the end of the day would have like a pot of money that they would hand out at the end of the year and say, all right, I like you and I'm going to, give you this or whatever, versus really have structures around levels of pay for your experience and what you bring to the table, and then a certain allotment of pay based on the performance and how I'm going to rate you. And even something as simple as that does create equity for people because it removes biases from, I'm just going to hand you, I'm just using pay as an example, hand you money because of how I feel and think about you versus what you delivered and what you contributed. And here's the structure around that that's going to help me make it a level playing field for people. I mean, as an example. But I love that you bring that up. And I know I just said a lot, but what do you think about that?
Well, I feel like, again, this is a big topic, and I've had a lot of very direct experience with it. It's like without having equitable systems, and I really wish that they had not gotten rid of this term by itself because it's so critical. Then this just natural bias creeps in, and it's not that we're bad people. It's just that we are biased by, our brains are biased. And so like some of the things I saw beyond pay that you have to have systems in place to overcome, or like one of the things that I saw a lot of is when we looked at the percentage of people getting promoted. And then you start to slice that by gender or by race, ethnicity, whatever it is. Like one time it was just really, my HR partner had this incredible spreadsheet she produced for me that basically showed the percentages of promotion by gender. And it was like, okay, what is happening here that many, many more men are getting promoted than women? There's obviously, it's not that the performance is bad, that there's something happening here, and we have to be able to see that. And then in tech, this was another thing, and this I think happens so much. There's this bias that women are not as technical as men, or not as gifted technically. And so what I saw in the company where I worked is the most senior person in the technical field who wasn't if they didn't take a managerial path, was an architect, a software architect. It was a very prestigious role, and it was like 100 men and one woman, literally. And then if you look down at engineering overall was about 30% women. So are you actually saying to me that there are, of those 30%, none of them could be software architects? No, there's some equity problem here in how we're identifying future software architects. So let's put systems in place to overcome that natural bias. This is where I think we really have to pay attention to equity. It doesn't happen and I think about inclusion as inclusion, you make sure everyone feels they have a voice, they're welcome. But without equitable systems, inclusion is not going to get to that. It's a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I agree with you. And look at the data, right? And I think that's where you're leading with that. And I think it's basic. There's some great HR people who are on this call also commenting on it. We'll put those comments up in a sec. But I think about looking at the data, right? The data speaks for itself. And I love that example of at 1 out of 100 software engineers, for example, 1% of 100 are women, and yet there's a 30% population of engineers. Makes you
Right.
question, like, how are we not understanding, seeing, assessing that 30%? You know,
Exactly.
it tells you immediately that there is a bench on the way into that role. And so, to your point, what are the systems? And typically, I know this isn't an HR call, but I'll talk about this and like why it's really important when leaders, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, like, oh, I have a job opening. I want to hire this person, right? But then I'm always coaching my leaders or coaching my team who's coaching the leaders. First of all, what's that part of the business trying to accomplish? What role are they trying to, what capabilities are missing? Let's define that and then let's hire based on that. Because typically what happens, and again, it's just human nature. I don't think
Yeah.
it's malicious at all, but it's like usually someone's going to go, I know someone for that role. And when you don't create the structure, and I'll keep it as simple as a I'll call it a job description, right? Skills and capabilities
Yep.
required for the role that you're trying to fill based on the business outcomes that team or that function is trying to now deliver. Then there is some structure around now let's go look for the beings, the skills and people who can fill this versus what typically happens because I've seen it over my past 25, 30 years is because you kind of know somebody. And until you put a structure in place, that diminishes that equity to your point. That's like one very small example of how that plays out. And I think the data too, it's smart that you had an HR business partner who is not only looking at the hiring data, so again, at the end of the day, when you look at the diversity of your organization as it relates to the diversity of the availability of that skill set that's out there in the marketplace, that's old school, but still relevant. When you're looking at that, how do we measure up against that? But then I love this whole promotion rate. I love this whole term rate, people who involuntarily leave,
Yeah.
to look at the data to say what is happening in the organization that they don't feel like there is an equitable, when I say equitable playing field, right? It is about looking at that data to then create the systems to help encourage more participation, right?
Yeah.
I love that you started with that. And so I think, I mean, I think Lori might be a bud of yours, but she's been making so many comments. But yes, you're right,
Oh, I don't
Lori.
know, Lori.
Oh, okay. Well, so much to say about equity. Yes, I love that you brought an expert to your team to deep dive on every people process. I think that's super critical. And actually, for a period of time, if you are a public company, and I know ESG is a whole other topic, but environmental, social, and governance for a lot of social impact measures that a lot of these investors really took a look at, pay equity and just equity in systems was a really big deal around the S part. And I love that, there are people out there, experts, who can come in and help you if you don't know where to start, who can help you actually audit your entire organization and start somewhere, right, with
Yeah.
creating these equitable people processes. So I
Yeah.
love that. Oh my gosh, I know there's been a lot of hubbub around that, but I'm so glad that you had mentioned that. And I love the framework that you're using. I think you even talked about this too. And there's something about being inclusive. Again, I'll use the word inclusive. Was it a language thing? Because, you and I talked about this too, where is the word equity not problematic, but is it a scary word to people, right? Is it just easier? I hate to say that. Like, is it more relatable when you use the word inclusiveness versus equity? I think they're both very different and they need to coexist. But yeah, it's a wonder.
It is
Like,
a
is it a
wonder.
language?
I
Is
yeah, I
it a
mean, I
language thing? I don't know.
I know. I mean, I don't have an answer to this, but I just
Yeah.
wonder, are people more comfortable with like, oh, inclusion? I don't think it's going to be off-putting to people, but when we start to talk about equity, then people get scared. I don't know, but I'm wondering. I'm putting that
Yeah.
out there as like maybe that was part of the reason and backing away from the controversy. There's been so much controversy and backlash against the whole DEIB movement in recent times, and so maybe it was a way to appease some of that. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I'm not really sure either, and nor do I have this research in the background and the context for how that decision was made. But what my last word, I guess I would say on DEIB, and I'd love for you to weigh in, and we talked about this before we jumped on stage, is look, at the end of the day, I know a lot has evolved and changed. There was a lot of people to rush to create DEIB officers and functions back in 2020, and a lot of them have gone away or been significantly reduced. I will stand on my advice, which is look, the foundation of any DEIB strategy for a company really starts with your purpose and values and the core strategy of your company. The why and what you're doing is based on what is it as a company that you're trying to accomplish, and build it on that. And then all of these amazing leadership behaviors that can be defined. I think that's also very important from a culture standpoint to make those outcomes really happen. So I don't know if you have a last word on DEIB before we shut that down for now.
Maybe
Yeah.
just to add on to what you said, I think it's so true that, of course, in the aftermath of George Floyd in the US,
Yes.
especially in 2020, when all of suddenly companies that had never paid attention to DEIB suddenly like, oh, now we're going to hire a chief diversity officer.
Yeah.
I think to your point, they didn't tie it into their business and their strategy, and it was an add-on and a nice to have. It was usually not well funded. There were not clear goals and measures and outcomes for these people who took these roles, and then they were seen as dispensable when the economy got tough or whatever. And I think what you need to do is to tie all of this, to your point, to the strategy of your company and
Yes.
how investing in a more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable workforce is going to give you better business results, better innovation, better
That's right.
performance, better employee engagement, better retention, all the business outcomes you're going for. We have the data to back that up, that a more diverse and inclusive environment will do that. So tie it to your business outcomes and don't put it off to the side, tucked away somewhere with no funding and no measurements.
That's right. And I think that is a good word to kind of bring a fine point to that, but then I'll bring it back to who you are and what you bring to the table around giving people the gift and the ideas of how to be a boldly inclusive leader. I think the biggest cry for help, if I'll say that, that's a pretty dramatic thing to say, but the cry for help for organizations to kind of get back in step is creating these healthy cultures of thriving you
Exactly.
know? And so if you were to give like one, I know you've given kind of the framework of being a boldly inclusive leader. What is like the one thing? I always love to boil it down to what is the one thing that anyone listening to this, watching this right now, that they were to like, okay, go on with their day and go on to their next thing. What is the one thing that they can begin doing or continue doing to be a boldly inclusive leader to create that kind of inclusive culture? If you were to boil it down to that.
Yeah, I think, the one thing, and it's well, I'll put it to one word and then I'll just
Okay.
explain what I mean by that. I
Yeah.
think where we really have to get curious. We have to dial into curiosity, and that means listening and learning and getting to know people who are not like you, and really just hearing the voices that you may not be hearing. And so it's kind of getting out of your little bubble and your comfort zone and
Yeah.
overcoming I'm most comfortable with people just like me. I have natural
Yeah.
empathy for people like me. Where I need to go is I need to get curious to understand the people that may be challenging to me, that may push my buttons. This is where we have to go if we're going to be boldly inclusive. And we have to be open to learning from them, to even
Yes.
changing our mind. Like, I think a boldly inclusive leader is someone who is willing to take in new ideas and information and change their mind based on something they've learned. And that's hard to do.
Yeah, it is hard to do. I love that though. I think it is about the word curiosity and being curious about others, which means that the opinion you might have might change as a result of it. I think about team members who know this about me, like come and say, oh, we're going to do this. Here's all the data that says this. And let's just say if I've led a human resources function, someone from Total Rewards might say, we want to do this. And I'll say, have you spoken with your peers? Have you talked with other leaders in the organization? I'd love to know what they think too. Because at the end of the day, it becomes a better idea. It's a
Yes,
better outcome because now you've invited people who think differently than you, don't even do what you do for a living, right? Like
exactly.
there's something that we might be missing because we're not curious about it. So I love that you're saying that. And instead of FOBO, fear of burning out, I mean, you could also say FOMO. Like, let's also think about FOMO. What are we missing out on when we are not curious? Be
Yes,
fearful of that. FOMO of missing out on an amazing idea that of course you clearly haven't thought about because you have to be curious about what other people think and how they vibe and how they roll differently. So I
yeah.
actually love that. Curiosity is such a good way to end with a one thing and how to be a boldly inclusive leader. I also love to kind of end our culture talks with just pop culture in general. Minette, what are you like into these days in terms of what are you reading? What are you watching? Eating, fashion wise, like, that's what I mean by pop culture. What are you vibing with these days?
Oh, fun. Those are fun questions. I am what I'm listening to and have been incessantly listening to. So my husband discovered this. I mean, didn't discover, but found she was coming to San Francisco. This amazing singer-songwriter from Mali named Fatoumata Diawara. And
Oh,
she is
wow.
incredible. So we heard her live a couple months ago in San Francisco, and now I have this Spotify, or I don't know if it's on Spotify or Pandora, but I have a channel based on her music, and I just
No
love
way.
her. She's incredible. Talk about a badass. Wow. So if you can see, like, check her out, Fatoumata Diawara. Watching we're watching old weird like British crime dramas. So
Nice.
we're watching one that's like just totally, to take me out of my every day. It's a British crime drama that's kind of old now called Scott and Bailey, and we've been binge watching that. Reading, okay, incessantly reading the New York Times and the Washington Post to see what crazy thing has just happened in the news,
Oh,
which is awful. And then I
yeah.
counter that by reading fiction because fiction takes me again. Like I've always been a fiction reader since I was a little kid, and I just read this really interesting book called I Hope This Finds You Well, which is a novel about a woman who basically inadvertently gets access to everyone's email around her. And so
Oh,
she read what
no.
everyone is actually saying.
I
Talk about,
think
yeah,
Oh, that is interesting though, because I think I've received a lot of emails that start with, I hope this finds you well, right? So
exactly.
that's an interesting title.
It's a
And to your
great title.
point, fiction and reality feels like it's both right now. And I love that you're incessantly reading the New York Times. And I think you said New York Post, right? Like,
No,
I-
Washington
okay,
Post.
Washington Post.
Yeah, those are the
Yeah.
two I subscribe to, Washington Post and New York Times. Yeah.
Yeah. And like
Yeah.
what is real and what's happening. I know we've kind of left the outside world because that would have taken us on a different tangent. But
Exactly.
I will actually end it with how is the best way for people to find you, Minette?
Yeah,
Like,
well,
yeah.
easy way is on LinkedIn. I love to connect
Okay.
with people, and then my website, minettenorman.com. So either way
Oh,
is
right
great.
on. Well, we'll also include that in the show notes, as well as all the hot tips around pop culture and this amazing artist that you've discovered. And with
Yeah.
that, I cannot believe it's the top of the hour. I want to just thank you so much for being a beacon of light around curiosity. I love that. Thank you so much, Minette, for joining us today on CultureCast.
Thank
And
you
then
so
we're
much
just going
for
to,
a great conversation.
oh my gosh, I can go on listening to you and learning from you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate you.